Good morning. It's good to be with you. It's been a great weekend of just kind of reflection and looking back and some nostalgia. I think back to like the mission trips I got to go on when I was here with Brother Jimmy and Brother Tim Hatfield and the teens. I think back to the Alkire youth rallies that I used to attend growing up in Springfield. I used to come in high school and to go to those things, to the preacher training camps. It was such a blessing each summer to get to do. I'm getting to put one together now in Arkansas and kind of learning what I learned from you and kind of taking that to the camp I'm going to be working with at Arkansas. And just love the Alkire Road congregation. I mean, y'all have seen me from since I was a kid till now. I mean, you've seen it all. It was all rough and gruff, and as I still am. But I thought back, I mean, when I first came here as an intern, it was in the May of 2013. I was right out of high school, had hardly any experience preaching, and I'd become friends with Mark through the preaching training camp and through Fort Hill and all of that. And so through the approval of the elders, the invitation was made for me to come, and so I'm there. And I was promised I would preach 6 times that summer, and I would have like 2 to 3 weeks to prepare for each one. Well, you may not remember this. We're going back into the files here. But when I first got here, Mark was in the hospital, okay? And it was like for 6 weeks. And so I know there's at least like 3 weeks I was expected week after week to preach on Sunday morning. And I was thinking I'd be in the office each week thinking like, how am I going to stand up and do another one of those? Like, man, and you had to bear in it, right? You had to bear with it. I remember it was like each Sunday like, well, Noah, you did it. It was a good try. You'll get to do it next week, right? Because it was rough, right? Because I was wrestling through those things. I was struggling with those things. And then I go off to Freed-Hardman, and I think everything's going great. And I come back here, and Carly Cross tells me that a lot of you were concerned. They would go up to Carly Cross and say, hey, is Noah making it okay? Is he doing all right? And I thought about that. I was like, why were they so concerned? Then I thought, if you had sat through some of those first sermons, you'd probably be concerned as well. And so I go to Freed. I'm ready to accomplish all things. I ended up doing well. But that first semester, I remember getting to the end of that, like I said, doing well, but getting to that, that first finals week. And if anyone, if you went to school, you know what that's like. It's a lot. And so here's how I was at the end of my finals week. And this was a picture my roommate took, and he put it on Twitter, and all he said was, he's been like this for 3 hours. All right? So, college is difficult. It's a struggle. And as I've gone on from college, I thought, kind of leaving college, life's going to get easier once you're out of college. And every college kid, you think like it's the busiest life you have in the world. It's harder than anything you're ever going to do. All right, then you get out of school and you get your first bill. All right? And so then bills get higher, right? Life actually gets busier. And then, can I hear an amen? The body gets slower. All right, all those things happen. And so life gets harder. It gets more challenging. All right? And I don't know what struggles you might be going through this morning, the things that you're wrestling with, the things that you're struggling with. We all come to the table each week, coming from different places. And maybe for you, that's been a job in the past 2 years. Maybe it's been unstable. Maybe it's been difficult. You've been struggling through those things. Maybe in the midst of all this, you've had family issues, family struggles as you guys tried to endure 2020 and 2021. Maybe because of the things that have gone on, it's been financial issues as the economy's been unstable, or maybe things through your job may have struggled. Or maybe it's even through your marriage that has been on the rocks and it's been a struggle for you. I don't know. But one thing I do know, in 2020 and 2021, all humanity has something in common, and it's the fact that we struggle. Right? That's been made abundantly clear. It's universal in the past 2 years. We've all shared a similar struggle. And so as we think about those things this morning, we want to look at the life of Jacob as we think about struggle. Because if you find yourself as a person who struggles with your faith this morning, struggles to be who you want to be, struggles to be a disciple, this past weekend we've been talking about being a disciple and what it takes to be a disciple, a lifetime learner, follower, and imitator of Jesus. And we're not pretending like that's an easy thing. We're told that's a very difficult road to travel. And so maybe you find yourself there this morning. You're struggling with your faith, struggling with your devotion, or with your faithfulness. And if that's you, then you should feel good, because there's some good news for you this morning, is you're not alone. All right, and we're going to look at a man named Jacob, who we often think of kind of as a hero of faith, as a patriarch, But when we look at his life, we realize this guy struggled like a ton. He was a struggler. And so let's look at his life for just a moment this morning here in Genesis chapter 32. But as we get to that point, I want to give a little bit of a history, because the struggle of Jacob really is the struggle of Jacob and Esau. So Jacob and Esau are twins, and in chapter 25, they're born, and Esau is born first. And so with that, being the firstborn, even though they were twins, comes all the rights of the firstborn, which were like really, it was a really big deal in antiquity. And so as Esau comes out of the womb, we're kind of already introduced to the struggle between Jacob and Esau, as if you remember, Jacob grabs the heel of Esau as they're coming out of the womb in Genesis 25 and verse 26. And then later on, a couple decades probably pass, and they're older now, they're grown. And we're told this situation also in chapter 25, in which Esau is like starving, and he comes in, and Jacob actually leverages stew to Esau in exchange for his birthright. And sometimes I think we kind of give Esau a bad rap here. We think like, okay, bozo, why'd you give your birthright for some soup? Right? But they didn't exactly have a McDonald's down the road. All right? Food wasn't as likely to come by. It was more difficult. You had to work for it more. And the text actually indicates to us that Esau was literally on the verge of death, or at least he feels like he is. And Jacob, a family member, which family and clans and tribes, they were meant to pool in resources together to help one another, uses that against him in order to take what mattered so much to Esau, what was a lot of his worth in antiquity. Right? And then, if it couldn't get any worse than that, you remember what then happens next. If you look over and kind of skim chapter 27, you have the struggle where not only did he take his birthright, but then he actually dresses up like Esau, puts the fur on his arms. We're told Esau is a very hairy man. And he goes to his father Jacob, father Isaac. Jacob goes to Isaac, and Isaac has poor eyesight. He can't see. And you know the story. He tricks his blind father into blessing him, giving him Esau's blessing. I mean, man, this guy's a jerk, right? He's just taking what's not his. And when you think about that, what then happens next then is that as Jacob has to flee, right? Because Esau gets so angry that it even says that he might be willing to take his life. And again, we might point fingers at Esau here and say, hey, it's not that big a deal, right? But we've all seen what a family will when someone passes on. We've all seen what that does to families, even today. I've seen it in the church, right? We see it tears families apart. And when we see what Jacob actually did to Esau here, maybe we might be actually saying, get him, Esau, right? We might understand from his point of view what he's wanting to do and the anger he would have felt. But nevertheless, because of the things that Jacob did, he's now having to flee. He's having to leave in order to avoid harm. And we wish that we could say it got better from here, but it doesn't really get better from here. Jacob continues to struggle. He goes in, the story of Rachel and Leah, and the story with Laban, his father-in-law, and things don't get better. Jacob continues to struggle in this relationship with his father-in-law as and vice versa. Neither one of them treat each other very well. They constantly are tricking one another and taking from one another until finally it gets to the point, here comes Jacob again, having to flee and to leave from his father-in-law because of the mess he again has gotten himself into. Not to mention all the familial situations that Jacob finds himself in through the use of favoritism and all of those type of issues. Not even to mention those things this morning. But as Jacob even ends his life, he even mentions that he lived an evil life. If you look over at Genesis chapter 47 and verse 9, Jacob, as he reflects on his life and he's going to bless his sons, he even mentions the fact that his days have been short and evil. Right? And so Jacob recognizes this, that he was a struggling person who struggled to do what was right throughout his life. And if you even look at his name, the name Jacob in Hebrew actually means supplanter, or one who follows at the heel, right? That makes a lot of sense based on the stories, right, we hear of Jacob. The way that Esau interprets his name is actually to say basically cheater. If you look over in Genesis 27 and verse 36. And so as we look at Jacob, you might be able to pick a few stories and say where he acted well in this area or that area. I'm not trying to totally dismantle any good thoughts we have about Jacob. But what we realize about Jacob is that this man was a struggling person. He had a faith that struggled. And so it all comes up to Genesis chapter 32, to this conflict between Esau and Jacob, right? Because of Jacob's conflicts with his father-in-law, and he was trying to, in different ways, supplanting his father-in-law's household as well, and his father-in-law treated him poorly as well, tricked him with the whole marriage thing, all those stories, right? But because of that, he's having to leave now, and he's forced to go back to family. And so Jacob sends some messengers to Esau. This is probably a couple decades later, right, that this has all happened. And he sends some messengers to Esau, and Esau simply responds, no big deal. He simply responds by coming with 400 of his armed men. And I want you to think about that. 20 years ago, you harmed someone to the point that they wanted to kill you. You come back asking for their help, and they're coming back with 400 people. You're probably not feeling on top of the world at this point. You're probably a little scared, right? This guy 20 years ago wanted to kill me. Now he's coming at me with an army, right? It's kind of saying, well, you and what army? Well, Esau's literally coming with an army to come and to meet him. And so Jacob, just like any of us, is terrified. And so what he does is he knows Esau will be there in the morning when he gets this message back, and he begins to prepare his camp and to get ready to have this meeting with Esau. And he's not planning to fight. He plans this great gift to be able to give to Esau, to like kind of this grand apology to be able to give him. And then we pick up with this story in Genesis chapter 32 of the night as Jacob sits and waits for, in his mind, his impending doom as his revengeful brother comes to him. So look with me at Genesis 32, where we find this kind of odd situation, where the text kind of abruptly, on the night before he's to meet Esau, kind of abruptly says that Jacob, as he was there alone, begins to wrestle with this man. So let's look there, Genesis 32, in verse 24. It says, and Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Right? We're not told anything about this man. It's very mysterious. We're going to look at some speculation about this in a moment. But it's kind of just this abrupt moment. Right? We're not told it's a vision. We're not told it's a dream. We're just told, and all of a sudden, basically, Jacob's wrestling with this man. And then the text notes that Jacob does not give up. He continues to struggle with this man. He continues to prevail, and there's no sign of the ending of this struggle. Look with me at the next verse there, in verse 25. It says, and when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, in other words, Jacob wasn't given up, right? He touched Jacob's hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Now, I don't know about you. If you've ever wrestled someone before, you probably don't have the ability to do that, to simply touch someone and to put something out of socket. And so that gives us this first indication as we're getting into this odd story in the middle of this bigger story that I've begun to tell this morning, that this is not a normal being. This is not a normal, quote unquote. You can almost see Moses, right, the writer of the Pentateuch. He's almost kind of putting air quotes there. It's like, and Jacob was wrestling with this, quote unquote, man. And then this man proceeds to touch his hip socket in the middle of the struggle, and it puts it out of joint, right? You and I can't do that. There's no man that could possibly do that by just touching something and causing it to fly out of socket. And so it's an indication this is some type of spiritual being. For who else could cause that much damage by simply a touch? But let's continue on in the text. In verse 26, it says this. It says, then the man said, let me go, for the day is broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So the man demands Jacob let him go. We'll explain this in a moment, that what I think is going on there, that the sun is rising and the man needs to go. And Jacob demands, he's demanding this blessing. He's struggling for this blessing. And you almost see this inner struggle of Jacob's life and what's going on here in the struggle that they are having. And then look with me in the next part of this text. Right? And Jacob wants to know his identity, but the man continues to keep his identity secret. But notice what happens in verse 27, where Jacob's name, the man actually has the goal to change Jacob's name. Verse 27. It says, and he said to him, what is your name? And Jacob said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Okay, and so Jacob's name is changed. Remember, the name Jacob, it means supplanter, with the implication almost that he's a cheater or a betrayer, one who's going to stab you in the back and take what is yours. And that's kind of, we look at the story of Jacob, that's kind of how he's lived his life. Right, so the spiritual being changes his name. Now, one writer suggests that when this happens, that when he forces Jacob to say his name, he says, "What is your name?" And Jacob says, "Jacob," that he's actually asking Jacob to confess in a sense, right? Because he's saying, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm a cheater. I'm a supplanter. I'm one who takes what isn't mine." And it's at that point that the spiritual being, unidentified, then changes his name to Israel, right? And one writer said this. He says, his opponent changes Jacob's name, thus announcing Jacob's new character and his identity, a new identity. As we think about the name Israel, right, this is important because this is going to define who Israel is for the rest of history and who they are, certainly in the Old Testament. His name was changed to Israel, which means God fights in the most literal way. And here it is implied, to make sense of this, it's implied that his name is thus changed because he has fought. It even says this in the text. He's fought or wrestled or struggled with God and man and has prevailed. Right? We can read that there in verse 30. Okay? For he has been delivered. It's verse 28 where it says, "But Israel, for you have striven with God and man and have prevailed." Right? And then this also gives us another indication that this man, quote unquote, I am really bad with this clicker. All right. All right. That this man, quote and unquote, isn't a man. For what man's going to come and to give Jacob this new identity? What authority does he have to name the great nation of Israel as it comes into play? Right? So here's kind of what I think is going on. You see in verse 29 that he continues to inquire the name of this man, right? But in verse 29, he doesn't get an answer. It says, "And Jacob said to him, 'Please tell me your name.' And he says, 'Why is it that you ask my name?' And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, 'For I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been delivered.' And the sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip." Okay, and so let's think about that for a moment. So what Jacob, the conclusion that he makes, and if you look, there's one of the prophets mentions that this is an angel of the Lord and how that's been interpreted. But that's not exactly what Jacob thinks. And telling us it's an angel really doesn't tell us anything. Do you know what the word angel means? It simply means messenger, right? It doesn't give us any indication of an actual identity of this man as you read it in the prophets. However, notice what Jacob thinks here. And this is how a lot of people have interpreted this text. Jacob names the place Peniel, which means, by the way, face of God. Jacob believes that he has seen the face of God in this moment, right? And it's not that he's prevailed over God in this moment, whether this is a manifestation of God, an angelic representation. Jacob seems to believe that there's a manifestation of God. Perhaps that's also why the man had to go because the morning was breaking, because we're told in Exodus 33 that no man can see the face of God and live. Right? And so in that sense, by the man leaving before the dawn, placing his hip socket out of place, he is actually delivering Jacob from certain death if he is to see him face to face. And that's why Jacob then names this place the face of God. And in this metaphorical sense, he's seen the face of God, and he has not prevailed in Jacob's terms, but Jacob says, "I've seen the face of God, and I have been delivered." Right? That's a little bit different. And so as we think about that, and I think about the struggle that Jacob has here, I love the way that this passage ends. And that's where we're going to spend a moment in our application this morning, and to think about how this applies to us and how it applies to discipleship. But as Jacob, in this huge moment of his life, as he's wrestled in his mind, and in my opinion, wrestled with this manifestation of God, and he's delivered, okay, but he doesn't walk away unscathed. Look at verses, we've already read one of them, but verse 31 and verse 32. It says, "And then the sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip." Remember, that God here, or this man, placed his hip out of socket, and so he's limping. "Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh." And so now Jacob leaves this moment, whatever you make of it, whatever you kind of think's going on here, but he leaves this moment, not the same Jacob that he was before, but he leaves as Israel, limping, you could say broken in a way, but he walks away in a different way. He walks away able, empowered to meet Esau, his brother. Now, to talk about the end conflict and how it all wraps up together with Esau, that's another story for a different time. not going to have time to get to that in this morning. But I'll tell you this, it works out. It works favorably. And you can't help but think, is it because Jacob walked limping, walked with a new name and with a new demeanor this time to approach his brother Esau, that he gets such a good response? And Esau shows him so much grace. And in fact, after Esau shows him so much grace, you can read this in chapter 33. This is a bit extra. Esau shows him an immeasurable amount of grace that Jacob did not deserve. Jacob says, I've seen through your face, I'm seeing the face of God through this situation. And so Jacob is a completely changed person. He sees that living God's way is better. And that living God's way, although we come out realizing that we're not the king of the universe, we're not the captain of our own ship, that we can't do things on our own, we can't force things to happen our own way, right? But Jacob now is able to walk away with a limp, having a deeper trust with God and having a new spiritual identity. As we think about this morning, kind of how we started out, realize life is a struggle, okay? Life is difficult. It's spent wrestling with yourself. It's spent wrestling with others. And in some sense, a metaphorical sense, it's wrestling with God. And if one is to prevail, and when we define prevail, we mean to press forward, to survive, to be delivered, every time you're going to be walking with a limp, spiritually speaking. Anybody who comes to Christ, absolutely humbled by their sin and receives that radical grace of God, the forgiveness of sins, the acceptance into God's community, that person's always going to walk away with a limp every time. Every person who comes to Jesus responds to the call that if you come, take up your cross daily and follow me, deny yourself, right? You'll be my disciple. Anyone who responds to that call is going to walk away with a limp, right? Because we're not included into the family of God because we're these people who have done so well that we got a special invitation to the church and that we're invited to be part of the family because we proved ourselves to be of worth. That's not it. We're invited to the family of God because we've responded to the call of God by acknowledging our sin, acknowledging the struggle that we have as a human being, and that we realize we cannot do this on our own. So we receive the grace of God, we're brought into his community, but for the rest of life, we will walk as a disciple with a limp. And I think about myself in this. I don't preach the gospel week after week to my congregation and to the people that I come into contact with. I don't preach because I think, I've studied so much, or I have something that needs to be said, or I've got such ability that everyone needs to experience it. That's not why I preach. I preach because I have been under the weight of my own sin, totally wrecked by the consequences of my mistakes and my decisions in life. And I've experienced the radical grace of God that I can't help but speak the word of God to people with a limp as I continue to point people to Jesus. And that's my role as a minister. And as I continue to press on, continue to preach the gospel, included in the family of God, receive the grace of God, right? As I continue to press forward, I'm not perfect. I continue to struggle. I continue to walk with that limp, right? But God empowers us. Any gift, any ability that we might have that we're given, we understand that's not because we're so great, but it's because God has blessed us with a gift. God has given us something, right? And so we walk away, not with our heads held high and look at me. We walk away with a limp, saying, I was delivered, just like Jacob was in this situation. And now for you, maybe this morning, whatever struggle you find yourself in, whatever challenges you're facing in this life, maybe those things in this past year have kept you away from church and kept you away from the family of God, kept you away from walking as a disciple in a variety of ways. And you might have a variety of reasons for those things. Perhaps maybe you look at the church and say, well, none of those people are living right? It's a church full of Jacobs. It's a church full of people who are struggling and aren't really living up to the standard that they claim to be living. And you'd probably be right? We all here in this room, we make mistakes. Surely people see us throughout the week making those mistakes. They witness those things. And so maybe we can meet people halfway there and say, yeah, absolutely. We struggle. We don't live up to everything that we claim to live up to at times. Maybe for you, you've stayed away from church. You've struggled with your faith because you've seen that high standard and you think, I just cannot live up to that. I'm not going to be able to do it. Or maybe with you, because of those things, it's a matter of you not feeling worthy enough, that there's no way that you deserve an invitation to the family of God, to the banquet table of the Messiah, right? I'm not worthy to receive that invitation. If you find yourself in that place this morning, then I've got good news for you, is that the church is a place for struggling people. Jesus calls it a hospital for the sick, basically. He says, it's not those who are well in need of a physician, but those who are sick. The church, in other words, is for people like Jacob. It's for people who wrestle to be faithful, who struggle to be faithful. It's for people who wrestle and they go back and forth and think through the great truths of God and wrestle through those things. And that despite doubts at times, we continue to press forward in faith, knowing that Jesus holds the world in his hands and that we have faith in him, knowing that we can't do this on our own. But we walk with Jesus, yet we walk with a limp. And to think about that for a minute, if we were all to walk with a limp, truly, with our coworkers, with our neighbors, with our family, with your kids as parents, if you were to parent with a limp, think about the great impact you would have for them to see the transparency that, hey, you don't have it all together. That church isn't a place where we put on our perfect faces, but church is a place that we come together to struggle with one another and to continue to profess that good faith that Jesus is Lord. As we undoubtedly struggle and as we undoubtedly continue to limp. So the church is a place for people like Jacob, right? And in order to live the life God has called you to live, we must be empowered by God. We're empowered by his word and what is revealed in his word. We're empowered by the power and presence of the Holy Spirit that we receive at baptism, Acts 2:38. And we press forward with that limp. And what we're told, though, is as we prevail, because maybe you think, man, that's a life of struggle. Do I really want to be a part of that? And the answer to that is, as we prevail, Jesus fills our cup. He provides us that rest in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. He continues to sustain us, to give us strength, right? This is that life that Jesus promises us, that real life, that real abundant, in a sense, and will soon be true eternal life, that cup overflowing life that is found through walking this difficult road of discipleship with Jesus. And so as we walk with the limp this morning, that decision to follow Jesus starts today. And if we can help you in any way, we invite you to come to Jesus, to bring your sins before the cross, to bring your faith to him, entrust yourself to him, and to pledge allegiance to him this morning in the grave of baptism. If you're here this morning, we can help you in any way. We invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.